What was the moment you found out you were going to die like?
Well, it was something that I remember distinctly, even though it was in the very distant past. I'm 70 years old, and it was I was around 8 years old, and it was the day after, rather, that my grandmother died. We knew that she was very sick, and my mom was like, "Oh, Grandma's going to die soon," and she did die, and the next day we were all, genuinely sad. Then later on in the day, I'm sitting in my bedroom just thinking about things, looking at my stamp collection and of United States stamps, and I'm like, wow, look at all the stamps. There's George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute, they're all dead. And then I was like, oh, wow. And then I thought about my mother, and I was like, well, that means that someday she will no longer be around. And I was 8 years old, and I said to myself, well, where am I going to get spaghetti and chocolate pudding from? And I still mean that earnestly. But then, honestly, a few moments later, I really got what I believe to be my first earth-shattering existential crisis when it occurred to me that at some vaguely unspecified future moment, I too will die and perhaps be summarily obliterated at any time for reasons I could never expect or control. And so that was my first confrontation with the reality of my condition as a human being. But quite honestly, I kind of buried that under the psychological bushes and didn't think much about it again until my first week as a professor at Skidmore College. And that was in 1980 when I accidentally bumped into books by Ernest Becker. And that kind of changed my life, both personally and professionally.
Absolutely. And you use a profound word called, you use confrontation. And that's a very
Yes.
important thing, the confrontation with death, the confrontation with mortality. And so, when you had this confrontation, was it a hard fork in your life? Was it something where you were immediately changed, or did you get back to equilibrium afterwards and forget about it?
Wow. All right. Well, my initial confrontation at 8 years old, I don't think that like I say, I think I pretty much buried that under the bushes. But I do remember I was 26 years old when I ran into Ernest Becker's ideas. And they're really simple. They're just like, yo, humans are like any living thing. We like to stay alive. The difference is that our capacity to think abstractly and symbolically gives us a sense of self-awareness that's at the same time incredibly uplifting and psychologically devastating. Because it's great to be alive and to know it, but on the other hand, unless you're cognitively impaired or in diapers, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you realize that, like all living things, that your life is of finite duration and that you too will someday die. And Becker argued that if that's the only thing you thought about, I'm going to die someday, I can walk outside and get hit by a comet or a pandemic, that you just wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. You'd just be paralyzed by existential anxieties. And he said, well, the way that humans manage those anxieties is by embracing culturally constructed views of the world that give us each a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And that essentially, and that ultimately what we're striving for, whether we're aware of it or not, is a sense of immortality, either literally or symbolically. And what Becker argued is that most of our lives and are literally devoted to maintaining confidence in our beliefs as well as faith in our value as individuals. And I remember reading that and I'd be like, wow, that at least explains a lot of myself to myself. But Becker, he then goes on and he's like, well, look, basically one way of thinking about the nature of personality. In his way of thinking is the way that we ultimately manage the existential anxieties engendered by the awareness that we're going to die. And so for some people, they kind of go the Albert Camus route, the existential dude who just said, come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. And of course, this goes back to minute one. Socrates said to philosophize is to learn how to die. Right, and so, and you referred to this idea of confrontation, and so that's one direction, is an explicit engagement with the reality of the human condition that ultimately and ideally allows us to come to terms with death in a way that ultimately maximizes our appreciation of life. That's the good news. The bad news is, according to the Beckers and the Heideggers of the world, is that most of us, myself included, from time to time, do not have the psychological fortitude to do that continuously. And they engage in what Heidegger called a flight from death, that we reduce ourselves to culturally constructed meat puppets that, in Kierkegaard's words, are tranquilized by the trivial. And as Becker puts it, we make a serious mistake of confusing our character, which is just a psychological defense erected to ward off death anxiety, with the kind of individual that we might ultimately become if we can shed that defensive armor and come face to face with life itself.
Absolutely. You bring up so many interesting things. One of the misfortunes, I guess, of being young is having the youthful arrogance of this is going to be the generation.
Me too.
Did you also have that as well? Like, oh, we're going to figure out medicine and technology and live forever.
Absolutely.
Did you?
Yeah.
What was it like for you? Like, what was that like for your generation?
Well, so really great question. So I was at the tail end of the 1960s. It was honestly a time for me of radical ambivalence, because on the one hand, there were the hippie days with a well-intentioned desire to minimize the structural inequities that pervaded the world at the time and still do even more today. Well, that was a good thing. On the other hand, as we went from the 1960s to the 1970s, I saw a kind of idealistic optimism. Let's make life better for everybody. Let's not figure out how to become immortal so the few folks that are billionaires could extend their life. So I thought there was a more egalitarian and sincere effort to extend life, not so much to deny death, although that was certainly part of it. But I don't want to sound like Walt Disney or Mary Poppins, but I do think that there was an element of good cheer and pervasive goodwill. Well, that kind of got and I do think that folks we're on the cusp of technological advances that make the extension of our lifespan quite viable. All right, but then we changed, basically from the 1970s to the 1980s. I'm in the United States, so I see the day that Ronald Reagan got elected president in the United States as the moment that we went from a potentially humane society to the fascist world that we now inhabit in America as a result of the election last week. But that started with Ronald Reagan ripping the solar panels off of the White House, declaring that government is unable and unwilling to help anybody, destroying the unions, And that kind of busted my enthusiasm for the viability of technology to improve the world for those around me. The folks in your generation are even more, I suspect, immersed in a desire to not die. So you have the billionaires at Google spending trillions of dollars, literally, in order to forestall death in ways that I see as understandable, but at the same time unfortunate. So this idea that I can offload myself onto a giant computer cloud and dispose of my body, I see that as, to me, it's like hoping that a frozen burrito could be resuscitated by putting it in the microwave. I'm having a hard time with the notion that we can abandon our bodies and remain in any way, shape, or form an enduring sense of self. And so that's one dimension that I think the Generation Z folks are immersed in, and that is surrounded by really able people that are nevertheless pompous and arrogant and narcissistic sociopaths that are more interested in themselves staying alive, even if everybody around them dies. And so that's one dimension. Another dimension that you know better than I is that the average young person, and I don't mean this cynically, and I don't mean this in a judgmental sense, but they don't even have much of a life where there's a direct intersection between themselves and nature and between themselves and their fellow human beings. My joke with the Skidmore students is that they have a more intimate relationship with their smartphone than they do with anyone around them. And I see that as a reflection of existential anxieties. After all, people die, but when your phone dies, you just go trade it in and get another one. People die, but when the avatar on your video game dies, you just push the refresh button. Experiences used to matter, and again, I'm not trying to be glib here, but I remember in the old days, if you traveled someplace, you would look around. I can't tell you how many times I've been traveling lately, watching people walking with the camera in front of their face or the selfie stick on a broom. And so, again, without judgment, this is just a declaration of fact. I see the folks in Generation Z immersed in a world that is both magical as well as malignant, depending upon the ways that these current amazing technologies are deployed. And so here's where I think the subtlety and sophistication comes in, because while at the same time, I would argue that current media technology has lobotomized the average individual, particularly in your generation, to the point where they're not able to discern the distinction between fact and fiction. I think it is also the case that this same technology is what is ultimately going to connect us and to render us able to confront our mortality individually while at the same time simultaneously engaged with our fellow humans.
Professor Solomon, it's so difficult listening to you and also trying to think about further questions, because there's like 7 different ways I want to take the conversation now. But you brought up three, among other things, 3 very interesting things. So I want to try to disentangle each one of those.
Sure.
So the tech billionaires and kind of the culture on death, I absolutely agree with you. We have, the Google folks, we have Elon Musk with the Neuralink.
Yep.
You kind of have this, in a strange sense, quasi-digital immortality on social media, because even if
That's
you
right.
die, your Facebook or Instagram profile is still up, which is a
Yes.
very strange thing. But then you also, and there's also like Brian Johnson as well, who's saying, don't die, so we're growing up with this strange relationship to death.
Yes.
I don't think we respect it anymore. It's slowly but surely something that, again, we don't see as nature. We see as a problem, a technological problem to be solved, or maybe.
That's magnificent. I could not have said it better. And I love your choice of words. It's about respect and the dignity that is we are infused with when we're capable of behaving in that fashion. That's
Yeah.
really wonderful.
And I also had this before, and then I realized that I was very, again, to use the term, youthfully arrogant. Because why would it be my generation that kind of topples death? It feels like it's always the generation that's just born saying, we're going to be the ones to figure it out. And then you also brought up the gaming experiences as well, and the phone, which also, again, morphs our relationship. One of the things about Gen Z and the digital natives, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, is that growing up with technology, atoms are different than bits, right? And so,
That's good.
again, our relationships to these things are, they're more fungible. You know,
That's right.
it's not an N of one thing. It's not a unique case. It's something where, oh, if my phone dies, just recharge it. If my character dies, respawn.
That's
And
right.
then this thing kind of corrupts their understanding of their own life, because then they start pushing away their interests, their passions. Oh, I can get to it eventually. There's a, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I should shut up and just let you keep going because I really think you have captured my sense of some of the prevailing psychodynamic conditions of the folks of your generation. Because the one thing that I've noticed about, and there's some literature, but we don't need to go all academic-y here, but there's a guy at Harvard, Michael Sandel, he's a philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit. And his point is, and again, it's not judgmental, but that when I was your age, it was easier being young because that was maybe the last time where it was okay to be average. After all, the average person is average. And what Michael Sandel points out is that has shifted under the guise of meritocracy. What we tell the youth now is, look, you're on the same starting line as every other person. And when the gun sounds, when you get born, you have the same opportunities to excel. And therefore, if you're not successful, it is entirely your problem and your fault. And success is defined by being the absolute best at what you do. So if you're going to be rich, if you're the second richest person on earth, you're a loser. If you're the second fastest athlete in the world, you're a loser. But that puts people of your generation in an absurd psychological pressure cooker that's amplified by the algorithmic nature of social media, exponentially confounded and compounded by misinformation. So, for example, most for heterosexual guys, when I tell them, when you see a beautiful woman like in Cosmopolitan magazine, you should know that that woman doesn't look like that. They are photoshopped to be 20% thinner than it is physically possible. So, if I can't floss my teeth with you, if you're a young woman these days, well, then you're too fat. But that puts women in an impossible position. In fact, when we show college guys pictures, not pornography, pictures of women in Cosmopolitan, and then ask them how they feel about their current girlfriends, they like them less and see the relationship as less secure. So here we are right now with folks in Generation Z, through no fault of their own, in the Western world, perhaps the first generation for whom there is no way you're going to be better off than your parents, while at the same time you're being held to higher standards. So I think it's a psychological ringer. You're in this increasing expectations at a time of diminishing opportunities. And I find that for a lot of the folks that I encounter to be very important and very significant.
I do want to try to use this riff to maybe explore something else. So like TikTok and Instagram, when you're going on there, not that I use these applications, but you have these like filters, right, to make
Yep.
make yourself look different. And so kind of the race to the bottom, so to
Yes.
speak, is the beautification filters. So I use TikTok, I get 2% prettier, then Instagram has to have the incentive to make you 4%, then
That's right.
8%, right? And so this is a big jump, but is there kind of like that beautification filter for society where we're trying to make everything beautiful, we're trying to make everything like perfect, like chips have so much sugar, candy bars are accessible, Netflix is perfect, so like no friction, and all of these things are perfectly curated to bring us out of this strange, peculiar alien world of if I'm left alone to my wits for 30 seconds, I'm immediately going to realize, hey, wait, like I have mortality. And this is just a small little quirk, or I think one of the reasons why shower thoughts are so profound is because it's the one moment that we're not using technology or being distracted.
Well said. I really like your take on these matters. And by the way, I think it's more important for folks your age to hear these ideas through folks like you. I tell my students, if you're having trouble napping, I'll give you one of our experiments and you'll be sleeping, by the end of the first paragraph. But you're really giving folks, I think, a good sense of the extent to which their complete immersion in a screen-mediated world is ultimately a shield from existential terror. But like all shields, there are times where they come down momentarily. And I like the shower example as a good one. I had a student a few years ago at Skidmore who did a very simple experiment. It was just asking Skidmore students to give us their phones for 24 hours. So we gave them little old-fashioned phones in case they had a disaster. They could call 911. But we then measured how they were feeling every few hours for 24 hours. And, the first couple of hours after handing in their phones, anxiety and depression skyrocketed and self-esteem went way down, demonstrating that we are literally psychologically mind-melded in an emotional and intellectual sense to our devices. On the other hand, after 12 or so hours, things started to turn around. People started to become less anxious and less depressed. And they said stuff to us like, wow, I didn't know there was a tree between the library and the dining hall because I was looking around. And then, of course, the experiment ended and they're like, give me my fucking phone back immediately. But it was at least suggestive of the possibilities of, without abandoning these technologies, integrating them into a more holistic take on ourselves and the world around us. So, again, my joke is, and I'm the same way, the weather's getting terrible, don't want to ruin anybody's days, and the storms are coming, the power's out, and I'm still there with my phone pointing at the television to find out when the power's going to come back on. And then I'm like, wait a minute, that's not going to work. And I say the same thing. You're going to wake up one day and DoorDash will not be there. And then what? And so, yeah, I do think this is kind of an important time. As I said earlier, none of this is to suggest that we go back to the Middle Ages and become serfs in a kingdom. But I do think that this is a really important important moment to work on, not confining our lives and our identities to media-generated and media-driven images, but rather to use it as a tool to get to know ourselves better, to get better connected to the folks around us. It doesn't need to be isolating and alienating, but unfortunately for many folks, that turns out to be the case.
Thank you for that. I do want to riff on what you were saying as well. It does seem like death, in a peculiar way, has gone from being a technological or a biological problem to being more of a spiritual or philosophical problem, at least now, or at least that's what we're trying to get back to. And it's
Yes.
also interesting how death went from a natural phenomenon to something that is just forgotten or disrespected now. And so you know, those interactions are very interesting. This is just a fun question for me, so if you don't have any thoughts on
Sure.
that, we can move on. But do you think our obsession with the apocalypse in media has anything to do with this kind of distraction theory? Or are these like undercurrents in our kind of like, we know that we have it too good and we're just waiting for the curtain to drop, we're just waiting for the music to stop?
Yeah, that could be. I think that's an interesting way to think about things. I would submit that this is an apocalyptic crossroads of sorts. Now, apocalyptic visions of life, go back as long as there's recorded history. And, some folks suggest that they're natural reactions to genuine, generally climate-like tragedies. Other folks are like, yeah, that's true, however, they can actually just represent our kind of apprehension and anticipation of a historical moment where we're at a crossroads of sorts. And so this is not the first time in human history that we've almost been wiped out by climate change. Not the first time in human history that we've almost been wiped out by pandemics. And so, here we are, but it may arguably be the first time that we have too many of these things happening simultaneously. So, we've got a pandemic, we've got, like it or not, the earth is melting. We've got, whether we like it or not, a global economic system that is magnificent as long as it keeps working. But it's not hard to imagine a major disruption in supply chains making the average individual unable to get a piece of bread by next week. And then we've got the raging political instability, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the so-called industrialized world. There's a guy named Peter Turchin who wrote a book called End Times, and he just argues, he 10 or 15 years ago said, I don't want to ruin your day, but America's going to fall apart right around now as a function of the income inequality, and that people are just going to get increasingly miserable. And that's when the ideological demagogues, be it Hitler or Donald Trump, I call him Orange Hitler, that's when the people come along, and rather than helping miserable people like FDR did in the New Deal after World War II or prior to it, you got the Hitlers and the Trumps of the world saying to people, only I can fix it, when in fact, in Turchin's language, you're just putting your foot on the wealth pump. That what's happening right now is the people that are most miserable and who just elected Donald Trump don't realize that he has no intention of doing anything to make their life better. And so basically, I think we are at a historical moment where the youth are, I think, an apocalyptic vision for the folks of your generation is understandable and appropriate. What scares the crap out of me are the people, with all due disrespect, my age, that are driving around hoping that eggs get a little cheaper, as if we don't have to do anything. And this is a big thing for me as an old timer on the cusp of oblivion. One thing we need to understand is that your generation is very different than folks twice your age. I mean this as a compliment. The general awareness of our current difficulties is much more accurate. But of course, unfortunately, that has led to an exponential increase in apprehensions, economic as well as environmental anxieties. So getting back to the apocalypse, I think that it is connected with concerns about mortality. I think it is generated at historical moments where we may be at a crossroads. The bad news is that your generation is just quite a bit more adversely affected by the current events in the world than the old-timers pretending that they're going to do something about it. That's the bad news. Good news is I've never seen a more energetic, imaginative, creative, right-minded, well-intentioned group of humans than the ones in your generation. Now, I think that there's a lot of work to be done. They've got to learn the difference between a fact and a TikTok, Instagram claim. They've got to be able to disentangle their existential anxieties from a rational deliberation of what's happening around them. Yeah, again, to be a little glib, but I'm like, I just hope that I hope the world could last until a couple of more million not so well educated mayonnaise chomping white dudes in the Midwest have expired, because this is a demographic point. I just think that if a sufficient number of folks of your generation can step back and to be, it's a trite, but yet to see things as they are, I think you're in a unique position to parlay existing technology, including AI, into something substantial and enduring. But I don't think it could be done, following the Elon Musks and the Bezos of the world, because they're as rich as whatever. And what are they trying to do today? Getting more rich. The Earth was completely locked down with a pandemic, and they're fucking flying spaceships. A guy named Gil Scott-Heron in the 1970s wrote a tune. He's like, he's a black dude in Philadelphia, and he's like, look, my sister's hungry in Philadelphia, and Whitey's hitting golf balls on the moon. And so I don't see the examples that we're getting from the rich and the powerful as particularly uplifting. But that does not mean that some of the infrastructure, technological and otherwise, cannot be conscripted into useful applications.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that in order to change civilization, it cannot be astroturfed. It has to be a grassroots movement. It has to be collection of individuals that all come together by their own volition rather than being told.
Yeah, and there'll have to be some grass, too. I'm being silly, but not. So grassroots, my point is anybody who takes John Locke, the old-timer philosopher, who just said that nature is just waste, that we've got to develop. And I'm like, yeah, with all due disrespect, if that's the case, then try eating money. And of course, the point is you can't eat money, but right now you can't eat without it. But
Right.
yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, I did have a question about, because you said you were born around the 1960s and you grew up there, and the hippie movement was also around there, and the hippie movement had a bunch of different perspectives on a variety of things. But number one, but one of the major things was death. You know, the way
Yeah.
that they looked at death, the way that they looked at life, the way that they kind of interacted with these thoughts. Did it have any impact on you?
Yeah, it did actually, although in an interesting way. Again, really good question, because the what's fascinating to me as an old timer is looking back and realizing that the hippie movement ruined the prospect of psychedelics being used in a useful fashion rather than entertainment. I make all of my students read The Doors of Perception by this guy, Aldous Huxley, 50-year-old Nobel Prize winning novelist, takes mushrooms for the first time. I think it was mushrooms, doesn't really matter. But, and he was just like, he was so amazed that he was saying in the early 1960s, I think there's going to come a moment where everyone in grade school does psychedelics, not for entertainment, but for the development of our character and our identity in a manner that helps us better accept the reality of the human condition. Yeah, but anyway, that didn't end well because the hippies got a hold of psychedelics, which then became outlawed in part because of its association with anti-war attitudes in Vietnam. This is a story for another time, but drug laws have nothing to do with whether drugs are good or bad. White bread and Fox News are more harmful than heroin and and LSD, at least when they're pharmacologically pure. But anyway, that really sidelined until recently what might be one of the most promising interventions for individuals and society in general. I'm not telling everybody to go out and be hallucinating every day, but the evidence is quite clear. And so I can't even remember why I started talking about these things. Yeah, except
The hippie movement, we were talking about the impact it had on you.
yeah, but I do remember, my experiences with those substances. I took a course when I was an undergraduate on psychopharmacology. I didn't do well in it because we did every drug that we studied. Should have waited till after the course was over. But I did find that even though it took me a while before I found the Ernest Becker books and realized that it had a lot to do with my existential anxieties. Yeah, I do feel like in retrospect that was one of the best moments about the hippie days because at its best, it was all about what I call these days a sense of cosmic connection. It was this idea that not everybody had to be great. You didn't have to be Jesus or Mother Teresa or Jimi Hendrix. Again, it may sound kind of silly, but there was just a pervasive sense of well-being that arose in the festive context of being in the company of our fellow human beings, often in the context of music, but not necessarily. Yeah, and those are the kinds of things that I think are exportable or rather transportable over time. And that, again, it may sound trite, but I do think that this is an important idea to begin to disseminate to folks of your generation, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic. So this gets back to we need to understand the really profound and pervasive effects of the isolation, physical, social, and psychological that resulted from the pandemic And just recognize some relatively simple things. For example, there's a study that we read in my little research group that just talks about, you know how sometimes you're just walking on a street and you see somebody, you've never seen them before and you'll probably never see them again, but you just like look each other in the eye with a little like nod. I know that you know that we know that we're here. Well, those kind of informal, a single informal recognition of our mutual humanity, that's often more potently effective than therapy. And so here's just a momentary connection with our fellow human beings. And so we got done with the pandemic, and people would come into my classes, and again, they'd have their earbuds in, they'd be planted looking at their phones, and we could have 30 people in the room, but they may as well have been hiding under their beds. They were not, even when they'd be texting the kid sitting next to them. Well, anyway, make a short story long. Well, I just had this idea. Every once in a while, I have an accident and a thought struck me. We were going to watch a movie, and I brought some snacks in, but I didn't start the movie. I just did nothing. And the kids just started looking around, and they took their earbuds off after a bit, and then they started like eating cookies. And blah, blah, blah. And anyway, I know it sounds kind of corny, but a woman in the class wrote to me and she said, you know what? That's the first time I've had a social interaction with another person in years, and I can't tell you how great that felt. And sometimes I get back to, I'm supposed to be a psychologist and we're supposed to understand. And we are, but we may be overthinking some of these things. And so I see it as really important in all generations, but to just fortify our genuine connections with our fellow human beings, and as often as possible to do so in embodied physical settings as well as through this amazing media. So this is not, we would probably not have these kinds of conversations, although I'd be happy to come up if you're in Montreal, but that's not the point. The point is let's not lose track of the benefits of these mechanisms, but let's not be subordinated to them to the point where we lose track of ourselves.
Yes, sir. No, it's difficult to keep your headphones in and keep your head down when you're in a city like Montreal, let's be honest.
That's right.
One of the things, so first of all, thank you so much for talking about those informal recognitions, because now, as someone that's very spiritual and someone that really respects that human connection, I'm going to try to make it a thing to forcibly do that as much as possible. Because, it's nice being selfless, because you give something and you also kind of get something in return, whereas selfish, you don't get either. It's a very strange thing. But I think that is a very great tenet, especially for Gen Z as well, to be told that. It's one of the things that we never experience, and I'm a very introverted person, and so for me to actually do that, I'm in my head constantly.
Me too.
It takes so much effort to just continue and go up to the person and go ahead if you want to say
That's
something.
right. No, I find it difficult also, but you said it earlier. It's if the world will change, it will be from the ground up, and I can't say it better except to be quoting you, and that is ground up, grounded in respect. And with recognition of our mutual hyperdependence. So one of the things about the phone world is, when I hold my phone up, I don't need anybody. If I got to get someplace, I Uber. If I need to eat, I got whatever, DoorDash. And it has created, I think, a false sense of independence and autonomy that has undermined our capacity to recognize how much each of our days is a result of the extensive interaction between people, but we've become less aware of that fact. And that's why I think it's important to restore awareness of that notion.
I'm not trying to ask you a very historical question, but if we could take a look at kind of the transition from death being something that was a group phenomenon to something that's a very individualistic thing. It feels like if I die, and I think that's one of the reasons why suicides took an uptake.
Yeah.
But I mean, suicide is also an interesting topic if you'd like to get into that as an aside. But why do we feel like death is a very individual thing now? Because it's really not. It feels like, as you were talking about before, we have the death of the climate, the death of the
Yeah.
economy. It feels like the death of democracy, death of the planet, all of these major things. And then it's like this pressure comes, and I feel this for some strange reason. It's all on me
Yes.
as an
Well,
individual.
because that's, you, again, this is the ultimate result of one of the silliest ideas in the history of Western thought, and that's John Locke's idea that there's no such thing as societies. There's only autonomous individuals pursuing their own interests. And we have become the ultimate in terms of death-denying societies. The average individual's never seen a dead person, rather. The average old person in my world is in Florida. We don't interact with folks over generations. We spend more money in the United States on cosmetics and plastic surgery to make us look young than we do on education and social services. We have lost, to a large degree, ceremonies and rituals that offer a sense of deep connection and community. And I think that has hurled each of us upon ourselves. In other words, under the guise of maximizing individual freedom, we have inadvertently divested ourselves of the cultural connections with our fellow humans and the richness of the ceremonies and rituals that allowed us to live and die together. I mean, nobody's going to jump into your grave with you, but on the other hand, for most of human history, our lives and deaths were curated in the context of belief systems that were credible and that were shared, and that I believe served a tremendous psychological function. And this is not to say that I'm advocating for us each to be totally reduced to cultural caricatures. On the other hand, in matters pertaining to life and death, there's a guy named Rollo May who wrote a book called The Cry for Myth that we read in my existential psychology class. And that's Rollo's point, is that we're pretty much now thrown into a world, and this was Nietzsche's point, the philosopher, when in The Gay Science he writes, God is dead. But you got to keep reading, because he keeps saying Christianity has become unbelievable. And his point is that for the moment, we lack a shared vision of reality that we can move through life with. And that has put the average individual, particularly in your generation, in a really awkward position. Like I keep saying, you're told you can do whatever you want, you can think whatever you want, you can feel whatever you want. Yeah, but that puts most of us in a psychological wasteland, completely devoid of any fundamental coordination and cohesion with our fellow humans. Except for very superficial and often ultimately self-deprecating aspirations like we get on Instagram and TikTok.
I feel like there's also a death sensitivity that we have, like a hypersensitivity. And so for young people, especially because they haven't interacted with these ideas ever, as you were saying,
Yes.
they haven't really seen a dead person. They probably haven't been to Florida and interacted with, the average
Yeah.
older person. And so they haven't ever experienced it, so they have no tolerance for it. So as soon as something happens, we see this immediate like worldview crushing. Oh my God,
That's correct.
you're immediately like going against my entire perspective, my entire personality, my entire character. And so there is like that confrontation, as we were talking about, that engagement with like not death, but something equivalent to that. Would you kind of agree with that, or is there a death sensitivity that people have, or is
I,
this
I, I,
overblown?
I love how you're putting it. I Now, to be silly as like an egghead academic, that's
Please.
ultimately an empirical question that's extraordinarily worthy of research. And when I meet with the students at Skidmore that are amazing, I'm going to bring that up tomorrow because, yeah, I do think that a lot of the folks that I interact with of that age are in the awkward position of existential insecurity such that there are innumerable triggers that could reduce you to psychological rubble. Back in the old days, and again, this is not a judgment, it's just a statement. It'd be like, well, okay, you didn't do that good in English, but I was okay in chemistry. I'm not going to be the richest person in the world, but I'm going to have enough to eat. America, again, as a caricature of a stereotype, we got out of World War II and democracy's working pretty well, at least for white people. I didn't understand the distinction at the time. But I guess my point is that I could have a lot of disappointments, but that didn't like crush my entire worldview, as you put it. Well, now I have students, it's like, oh shit, I got a B minus in chemistry. I'm going to disembowel myself in the parking lot. Or I can't believe that people just are mocking me because my phone is old. That I don't have like the iPhone 25 or whatever. But I like how you put it. I think that there is a wider range of events or thoughts that are capable of shattering the entire existential superstructure, and that puts one in a permanent position of being subject to extraordinary psychological crises. Yeah,
And we were talking about how, I mean, you said this as an aside, but I think it's incredibly pertinent that Gen Z may not be, maybe worse off than their parents, which is true, but I don't think we've really appreciated how strange and peculiar and how wrong that
that's
is.
right.
And
Yes.
if we can test this segue, talking about death, talking about this pressure on Gen Z on every aspect, from the digital to the
Yeah.
physical to the mental to the emotional, can we talk about the psychodynamics of fascism and how it
Yeah.
relates to that?
Well, absolutely. This is an eerie moment, I think, in history. I had already talked about this Peter Turchin guy who wrote a book called End Times. And his point is that societies come and go. And in modernity, they usually last between 80 and 100 years. And it's not a political argument. He's a data scientist, and he studies basically the social stability as a function of income inequality and what he calls elite overproduction. So his point is that that basically, when a society is stable, it's not that everybody's rich, but that there's a parallel. If the rich get richer, so do the middle and working class. So the rising tide raises all boats. But he's like, I'm sorry to ruin your day, but people being people, rich people are going to want to get more rich. And everyone's going to want to go to Harvard or become president, but there's only so many seats at Harvard. And so what happens over time is that the rich get richer while the poor don't. Everybody's trying to become the elite, but only a few can. As I mentioned earlier, that creates what he calls immiseration. And he's like, that people get miserable, but they also get physically shorter and their lifespans get smaller too. So he's like, I'm not just talking psychology. When the lower class gets pelted by the rich wanting to be richer, well, then the lower class gets miserable. Well, that is the substrate for the emergence of fascist leaders, because basically when that happens, that's when your ideological demagogue typically comes along and says, only I can fix it. So it was Hitler after World War I, when the Germans were in a terrible condition, who just said, I'm going to make Germany great again. All right, and then we had World War II in the United States. As Turchin points out, it could have gone either way. Hitler loved Henry Ford. Republicans loved Hitler. Hitler's genocidal inclinations, he studied the eugenics movement in the United States and the racism after World War II and the Jim Crow laws and so on. So Turchin's point is it could have gone either way in America prior to World War II. But what happened is that FDR got elected and the millionaires and billionaires said, you know what, let's share the wealth a little bit. And so there were 40 years where in America, for white people at least, things were going well. The rich got richer, and so did everybody else. All right, back to Ronald Reagan. That started increasing income inequality. Turchin wrote in like 2010 that America would collapse around now. So, and that's precisely what happened. Donald Trump is a caricature of a stereotype of the average fascist leader. They do tend to be malignantly narcissistic sociopaths with a touch of psychosis, paranoid delusions, and delusions of grandeur. But what you've got, and this is Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher, wrote a book about the origins of totalitarianism, and that's her point, is that when you have an immiserated working class, that is when it is ripe for an ideological demagogue to literally take over and lobotomize them by presenting them with a view of the world that appears to give them a sense of meaning and value. But what you're really doing, I call them alchemists of hate. You're taking the fears of the working class and you're converting them into hate. You're like, we got to kill the migrants. We can't let the Islamic terrorists parachute into Buffalo and rape our daughters and eat our chicken wings. In other words, what the fascists do is to misdirect the misery of their constituents into hatred against someone or something that you identify as the all-encompassing repository of evil that we need to eliminate. But what's really happening, and Mussolini defined fascism as collusion between politicians and corporate interests. And that's what's happening now. Basically, Donald Trump would not be president without Rupert Murdoch and Fox News and Elon Musk. What fascists do is to present a vision of reality that is 180 degrees opposite of what's actually happening. And so I don't know if that's sufficient in terms of explanation. And we know empirically that this is the case because basically we've done studies for over 20 years showing that people's political preferences vary dramatically depending upon whether or not death is on their mind. And so in 2004, Americans liked John Kerry more than George W. Bush, but if we reminded them of death first, they liked Bush more than Kerry. 2016, Americans liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump, but if we reminded them of death first, they liked Trump more. Ditto 2020 with Biden. So in our view, fascism is an understandable reaction. It is a comorbid relationship between a narcissistic sociopath and an immiserated public that has, through fear and hate, lost the capacity to recognize that the people that they are literally attached to at the psychological hip really don't care about them, really are not doing anything for their benefit, and in fact, are dedicated to making life worse. And so my message to Generation Z folks, with all due respect, is that if you did vote for Donald Trump, you just shot yourself in the face and the groin at the same time. Thing number one is he will accelerate the rate of planetary environmental destruction. Thing number two is that his plans to make the economy better have been unanimously recognized by Nobel Prize winning economists as gonna make it worse, except for the gazillionaires. Thing number three is that he is a white Christian nationalist, and anyone who does not identify as such should start packing their bags because things will get pretty ugly pretty soon. And that's my point, is that statistically way more young folks, particularly men, particularly people of color, voted for Donald Trump than one might have expected. And I would just respectfully ask them to step back a bit and to become sufficiently informed. Read what J.D. Vance said about Donald Trump 4 or 8 years ago, before he became a cult devotee. He called Trump America's Hitler and was quite right that he does not care about anybody, particularly the youth. And I think this would be a good time for the youth to step back, to reflect, to get connected, to learn a bit about democracy, because there hasn't been any since you guys were young, and to realize, and this is the most important, the unbelievable power that can be leveraged into constructive change when folks of your age group become actively involved at all levels. It's like right now, whatever you're doing, it can be in a way that improves things both at the local level as well as beyond. So that's kind of my classic comic book take.
I do want to be respectful of your time. Do you have some moments for your last couple questions?
Oh, yeah.
So we have talked a lot about death. We talked a lot about psychodynamics, fascism, etc. I want to kind of end it on a positive note.
Absolutely.
How should you begin thinking about death and maybe incorporating these thoughts in your life? I know Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophers, they had very concrete ideas about thinking about death. Aurelius would say, think of death as like a boogeyman,
I
that
love
when you
that.
take off the mask, there's actually no one there or nothing there. Not in a
Yeah.
supernatural sense, but just you realize that it's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, and I like Montaigne talking about death as like riding on a horse. You know, you could get tossed off at any time. I do think it is important to recognize that, like it or not, I like this guy Alexander Smith who said, "It is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." This was a young Scottish dude in the 1800s, but it gets back to what I've said earlier on, and that is that I do think the awareness of the inevitability of death, I do think that that's important for all of us to acknowledge and to keep going and just note that that presents us with a psychological fork in the road. I do think that let's do the downside first. Malignant manifestations of death, anxiety, bring out the worst in us. And if we had more time, and I'm happy to talk more anytime if this is worthy of continuation, but
Absolutely.
basically we know from our research that when we remind people that they're going to die, that it makes them depressed, it makes them more prejudicial against people who don't share their views of life. It makes them more apt to vote for a fascist, makes them more hostile to the environment, uncomfortable with their bodies, makes them more stupidly concerned with just buying stuff and getting more money. And I like this guy, Robert J. Lifton, who just said, we may have the ignominious distinction of being the first form of life to be responsible for our extinction. All right, fine, that's the bad news. Meet me in back of Skidmore, we'll drink Woolite in the dumpster. All right, but the good news is that we humans have a great track record of extricating ourselves from really difficult situations by understanding what underlies them. So I like talking about the pandemics of the Middle Ages. Half of Europe died, and they were still dying as long as we thought that the pandemic was caused by evil spirits, right? But then we figured out that no, it was bacteria. That gave us penicillin, modern medicine, and why most of us are here today. Well, ditto, if we can individually and collectively recognize that, like it or not, our stance towards death influences our personality and it influences our interpersonal behavior, well, that gives us a potential blueprint for a radical transformation of humanity. In other words, I see, and here's where Nietzsche pointed out that sometimes we need an apocalyptic collapse. He's like, well, that may not be fun, but oftentimes it is what comes out of the psychological and physical rubble and the aftermath of what appears to be a looming disaster that really makes things extraordinarily better. And so here's where I think that there's an upside. Well, we are now in a world, I just said that we're all kind of alone and isolated sometimes. At the same time, though, you talked about spirituality earlier, and I know it's kind of semantic, but I like that word. It sidesteps some of the problems of religiosity, but I see spirituality broadly defined as a way that we can, once again, individually, but at the same time collectively, engage with how we want to live our lives while recognizing that we won't always be here. I can't remember if it was Epicurus or Lucretius, who just said, we think about it. A book would not be satisfying if it never ended. If you were at a banquet and they kept just stuffing you with food and drink, wouldn't there come a point where it would be less than optimal? And I like how Lucretius, I think, puts it. Whereas, if you're at like the most amazing banquet ever, well, it's amazing in part because there'll come a point where the meal is done, you have dessert, and why can't we, as a metaphor, why can't we think in terms of our lives as a giant journey, a giant banquet? And surely there's something important about the conclusion of either of those kinds of experiences. So yeah, I'm trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, I do think that death denial is a central explanation for most of our human hazards. But at the same time, there's the other direction that we can move in, and that we can utilize the same cognitive and emotional facilities that got us into this existential dilemma to extricate ourselves from it.
Beautifully said, sir. Beautifully said. We forget that death is precisely what brought us all here, and not just
That's right.
death in terms of like humans, but death in terms of like stars. Like the stars had to explode, all the elements had to go around, and then all of these things. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm really uplifted by how you're putting it. You don't need me to say these things. You're doing it in a just stellar fashion. That's where I think we ought to be heading.
Well, you mentioned books. If you would not really enjoy the book if it never ended. I know you asked this, or Lex asked you this question. Do you have any books, podcasts, TV shows, movies for us to? I know death and thinking about it is not a light switch. It's kind of like a
Yeah,
slow but sure kind of slow meal, I guess, to digest and such.
yeah.
Any pieces of media you would recommend for young people or folks in general?
That's really that's a great question as an old timer because I'm more of an academic egghead. There is a book that came out last year called Radical Mindfulness by a guy named James Rowe. Beyond that, I'm at a loss. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to email you
Sure.
some suggestions. I'm going to ask my students tomorrow. Let me get some input from the youth.
Yep.
And then let's hope that folks that have listened to this today give us some suggestions if anything comes to mind. My hope is that this has been a useful conversation. Selfishly, I really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we get to exchange ideas again. But I want to put this back out to the folks that are going to be the beneficiaries of these podcasts. I think this is the way to get ideas in circulation. And I think I know you already well enough to note that this is not just a unidimensional us talking at people so much as hoping that we're going to end up talking with folks. And so, yeah, folks that are out there, you know how to use the internet. I'm at Skidmore College. Feel free to write to me if you've got questions and concerns. And yeah, step up if there are things in popular culture, movies, music, anything. Let's start moving those ideas around. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting how before death was something that you weren't supposed to talk about, but now it's something that you can't even think about.
Yeah.
Just one last question, and I am testing this question out. I do have this kind of like hesitancy to ask it, but it's also, for me, again, it's a grassroots thing. I
You
feel
go.
like we're not comfortable anymore, not just talking about death, but talking about big ideas.
Yeah.
There's a certain arrogance that people think that you have with even attempting to think about it. So I have this last question for you. If someone gave you a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
Oh, wow. great question. I'm really ambivalent because on the one hand, I'm gonna talk out of two sides of my face. If on the big end of things, I really would be a big fan. I'm big on fire and fascism at the superordinate structural level. It's like those things are related. Fascists have no interests in fixing the environment. And as the environment gets worse, that breeds fascism. I'm saying that based on scholarly work, not my opinion. So if I had, that'd be like one want, would be, hey, well, if we could foster some kind of political stability, that may give us, yeah, so let me go with this. One wand would be to make the people in the world realize that we all as humans have more in common than we are different. Because humans are extraordinarily pro-social and uber cooperative and helpful to whoever we think is in our tribe. And so if I had one wand, it would be, let's just get one tribe, humanity, and let's work together to render the planet fit for human habitation. All right, so that'd be like one direction. And then the other direction is this guy Krishnamurti, a dead Indian philosopher who said something like, everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. And so my other wand would be when I'm looking in the mirror to remind myself that I'm all too human also, and maybe to nudge me to continue working from the ground up, as you so eloquently put it. So I'm going to try and have it both ways and say we need a top-down and bottom-up wand.
Beautiful. Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives, will imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, and nations in order to deny the fact of death. And that's from James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, in your paper, Death Denial in the Anthropocene. Dr. Solomon, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was wonderful.